Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to Catholic Mysticism, where Bielawski talks about the supernatural aspects of our faith, the saints, and other related subjects. Now, here he is, Bielawski.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And I just want to start the show. We'll touch on a couple things here tonight. But it seems to me, the last week or so, reading some articles and just listening to the news, but when watching the news, it seems that we definitely have a problem with truth here in this great world that we live in. And it occurs to me that, years ago there was a song by Phil Collins, a famous musician, and I don't remember the title of the song, but there was a line in there, Land of Confusion. And I think that pretty much sums up a lot of state in which we find our country, our world, and even our individual and personal lives themselves. It seems that every time we turn around, there's this story or that isn't true and this is true. Oh, no, wait a minute, that wasn't true. What I've got to say is true, and there's no foundation. And we search for this peace, this tranquility in our lives, in our world, in our country. And it seems the harder we strive, and the more we try to achieve this, the further it seems from our grasp. And why is that? We talk about the supernatural here, and this is a prayer that I pray for pretty much daily. And I think we should add it to our prayer hit list, so to speak, that we want to add on. And that might be for the gift from the Holy Spirit of discernment. Discernment and wisdom. Now, wisdom is to know what God's will is in our lives, and being able to have a practicality in that day-to-day living that we seek so that we can have an orderly life. And I don't know about you, but it seems lately, in my particular personal life, there doesn't seem to be a lot of order. And a lot of it's because of my own doing, and maybe you'll find that's similar to yours, because of scheduling and doing this thing and then bouncing to that one and then bouncing to the next one. And it seems that there's not enough hours in the day. So part of that is with the makeup, I think, at least in my life and maybe yours, of what we're taking on. Some by choice, some we don't have any choices. But when we get scattered like that, at least I found, things usually do not go as well and as smooth. So sometimes I think we need to pray for the discernment and the wisdom to have this daily practicality to our lives so that we can get order. Because when we do have order in our life, and I think you might have seen this in your own, you do find happiness. Things seem to click, they seem to go smoother. So sometimes we need to have more quality rather than quantity to do one or two good things well than have a bunch of things on our plate and not do them well at all. Because when we strip this down, we're going to find out that the father of confusion and this distraction is all part of the devil's makeup to take us off the path we should be walking on. And it can be smack dab in our face, or it can be very subtle. And we have to watch out for that. Because when it's subtle, we may be volunteering for several parish activities. And the intent is good. It is in good intent. But by being there so often for so many, we may end up actually taking that good intent and not having the outcome we desire. And that can cause confusion in the people we're trying to serve as well as our own lives, because we can certainly feel that not only are we letting the other people down when we're too busy and stressed, but ourselves. And when we're like this, people around us as well as ourselves have to pay the price. Because if you're anything like me, when I get stressed out and tired, I also can be very cranky. And normally the patience that you would want to have isn't quite what it should be. And you're liable to say or do something that certainly you'll regret later. But, sometimes people have long-term memory, so we want to be careful with that. But that's what I meant by a trick of the devil, because that can cause a fracture. One of the things we're going to talk about a little later is the forgiveness. But we see this confusion of the truth and the distortion of the truth designed with intent and purpose. And I do mean that. When we look today, I'm going to just take our country for right now, and we look at the media today. And I don't really like the title mainstream media, because, there's just so much media today through the internet, through the regular TV channels, through radio, through Sirius. You're bombarded. And that is also a trick of the devil, to bombard us with all this noise and distraction, as I mentioned, so we cannot focus on the solitude we need to really hear the whispering that God has for us and wants to reveal to us in our lives through the quietness and solitude and that little whisper, not the big shake-up most of the time. But we see in this country a media that is agenda-driven. There are times now, lately, quite a while here, the last several months, we see that there are no facts that are backed up by these stories. And that's a dangerous thing for journalism to take and walk that line, because they're going to do a great discredit and disservice not only to themselves, but to you and I as the people that live here in America. Because eventually, as stories and distortion and lies are revealed, we're going to rely less and less and less on a credible source. So their sources will not have any credibility, therefore we will not pay any attention to them. Because as the old saying goes, you can only cry wolf so many times before nobody pays attention to you. And when you have an agenda, now back in the days they used to call that yellow journalism, and it is alive and well today, because there's a purpose to an agenda. Now the purpose is usually driven by power, to try to influence people to either believe or succumb to what the elite or people in power believe should be the way to live. And very, very unfortunately for us in this country today, and this is a major part of this confusion, is it's not based on any type of morality that we've known through the past, or that is based on a conscience that is religiously inspired. So when a conscience cannot be properly formed through what we, you and I listening to the show, believe are those Judeo-Christian principles which this country was founded on, and which we believe came from God, then you don't have a gauge or a foundation to base that morality on. Because even if you're atheistic and wish to do well for people, and many of them do, they don't want to see hardship, they don't want to see any type of suffering, things like that. And they strive, and they're decent people that try to help people out, especially those people that are in need. But it doesn't change the fact that morals, some of it we can see instinctively, intrinsically, is in our soul. That's implanted by God, and everyone has that. We know it is not right to kill people for a gain or a profit, or just to, as I mentioned, to gain something. So if a couple was committing adultery and there was a husband or spouse in the way, you can't kill that other person that's involved to rid the way so you can walk in the open door. We know that. Intrinsically, we know that's wrong. We don't need to have a law that tells us that's wrong. But to show you how far we've slipped, we now have a hotbed debate for years and years and years where we no longer see the killing of innocent children, i.e. in the womb, abortion, as a moral evil. Now think about that. That is an argument and a law that we have in this country now. And it's put in by groups like Planned Parenthood and others, and are media-driven because money, when you, as Mr. Clinton said, follow the money. And you'll find that's behind a lot of things. And when you see how much influence Planned Parenthood has in their donations and the donations they receive, you can see that there's an agenda here. And it's frightening that we've come to a point, which should be a basic point, because if we gathered around a table and told people that at one time a certain group of peoples of the ancient world burned their infants and their children to the god of fertility for good crops, they, I would think, in general, think that would be barbaric. But there would be probably some who would say, well, you know, it was just doing what they thought. That they thought that that would help out the entire group because they'd have a good year of crops, and that was their truth. And that's where you walk that line where there's definitely confusion here and distortion and distractions of the truth. Because the truth of the matter is, and our Catholic Church teaches us, that no intrinsic evil, if that evil is intrinsic, then no good can really come out of that. Hence the argument, well, you know, Planned Parenthood does a lot of good things. Well, those good things that they do would be offset by far by the evil of the abortions that they do perform. And you can't do that. If you remember, that's like saying a mobster or a gangster would go and build a school in the neighborhood or give back money to the neighborhood or loan money out. But if that money was by being involved in extortion, drugs, or murder, it doesn't matter. That good is erased. You can't justify it by another intrinsic evil, such as the murder or extortion, what have you, or feeding people drugs so they become addicted and have a habit and create the chaos and destruction that drugs make available to the people that use them. So we've got to kind of draw the line and ask for that discernment and wisdom to know the truth. And the truth in that matter is that killing is killing. As I mentioned before, I think we can agree that if left alone in the womb, whether you want to call it a batch of cells or a blob of cells, if left alone, it's going to develop into a human. So by terminating this, we have snuffed out the life. I mean, to me, it's pretty common sense. I think to a lot of people it's common sense. But words are a very powerful thing we use in society. We change the word. Pro-choice makes it look as if it's something other than pro-death, because that's what we're choosing. We see now that euthanasia is being fought in many states, in my state, Connecticut, quite a bit. The last 3 or 4 years, thanks to the Family Institute and a host of other people and supporters, it's been defeated every year as a bill. But I went to the hearings and listened to some of the elected officials. Whew, I tell you, it's an eye-opener. Because if they have a personal experience of suffering, it changes their perspective. And when our part of the agenda, I think, of the elite and powerful, and this is a personal opinion of mine now, is that they want to create a world in which it's a utopia where there'll be no suffering, there'll be no sadness, there'll be no illness, there'll be no poverty, there'll be no poor. But the key is that it will be without God. They will be in power, and they will create the utopia. Now, and I'm going to take a shot that most of us listening here believe in the doctrines of original sin. And we know then that due to our human makeup and our weakness, we can't have that here. We will always have what St. Augustine called concupiscence, which is the inclination to sin because of the fall in the garden. So no matter how much we strive, we are always going to fall short of the mark because we are not God. God is the only one who will change and make the new heaven and a new earth. But that doesn't stop us from trying. And with all the technological advances we've made, there's a point now where people are becoming excited about this because they can see some of the sufferings being alleviated. And yet, while none of us likes to suffer, if we believe in Christ, we believe in when he suffered for us and what he said about suffering with his cross, we are tied together with our sufferings to bring about that victory over Satan through our own personal crosses in our lives that Christ underwent his passion. And that passion was not easy. You know, I went to a little one-day seminar on the Shroud of Turin by an expert, and it was fascinating. And what he was saying was that with the Shroud of Turin, because he's an expert on that with all the new technology, that they can medically prove now that this was a man that underwent incredible torture. And he explained to us that the Romans used what was called a flagellum. And it was a whip, but it had two little balls. And in these balls, they could attach pieces of steel or bone to hook into Jesus' flesh and come out. And they're able, and he had an actual flagellum there. He was able to match up the balls in the shroud and show us each wound. And there were also marks that were horizontal on the back, and that these were sticks. So he was, in a way, caned. And you could see the marks on the back in the buttocks. And leads us to another thing that I always suspected, because we have, with art, a sanitized version of the crucifixion and the passion, that Jesus was nude, and that some of those scourging might have hit his private parts, and to add to the humiliation of being without clothes on top of this. He pointed out that the cap was actually the crown of thorns, and he had a model of it. And the cap would be pushed down by sticks, pretty much like what, if you saw The Passion of Christ by Mel Gibson, that's what the Roman soldiers did, because they couldn't get their hands, or they'd be punctured. And these thorns were huge. And they would embed themselves and hit the skull. They also have evidence that there was a piece of thorn in his lip from the shroud in the photographs. That one of the things he impressed upon us, he showed us he had a cross piece that Jesus would have carried on the way to his passion. And it weighed about 110 pounds. And the left hand would be tied to the cross, because those who were going to be crucified, they didn't want the criminals in this aspect to turn around and try and use the cross piece as a weapon, and they had to prevent them from running. So what they did was tie the left hand to the cross. Then they would take a loop from the cross piece and put it around their left ankle. And then Jesus' right hand would have been looped and tied to the next prisoner. So in essence, when they whipped the other prisoners on the way to Calvary, they would flinch. And this would cause them to move, which would cause the person in front of Jesus, which he was looped to cause Jesus to fall smack dab on his left kneecap and then his face to hit the ground. Hard. And each time they whipped one of the prisoner in front of Jesus, that would happen. Now, as he explained to us, the vertical pieces of the cross were already set in place, and that they would be bloodstained, and Golgotha was a horrible place. They didn't sanitize it. It smelled. It was filthy. And they would crucify so many prisoners, they never bothered to wash blood or anything like that. And so they would use these over and over and over. And one of the things they see from the shroud is they see that Jesus, from the cross piece, could have, I believe you mentioned, big slivers in there, in his shoulder. But they couldn't see the back because that's the right shoulder, I believe he said, because the cross piece where Jesus had it covered that up. But when they went to put Jesus on the cross, they bent his right ankle. This is the vertical piece now. They bent his right ankle all the way back so that the flat of the foot, now think of this, brothers and sisters, how painful this had to be. The flat of the foot against the vertical piece of the cross and drove the spiked nails, which he showed us were he actually had the hand hewn, because they didn't have machinists then, nails, brutal spikes. And then they would drive that into his foot to anchor the right foot being flat on that vertical cross piece. And then they took the left foot, put it over the right, and drove another nail home through there. He said that there was no resting block like we see in the art. And Jesus was able to go up and down to try and gain breath when it became too painful. Because one of the things he explained to us was that if you had a cramp in your calf, and I think most of us had, or a charley horse, you would have that enormous pain, and most of us have had that at one time. He said that is what happened to Jesus' entire body, and that he would tremble. He was actually trembling on the cross, and his body literally went into rigor mortis, but he was alive. Can you imagine that kind of pain? Can you imagine that kind of pain? He also said, and I believe this was portrayed in The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, that they had many peg holes around the cross pieces, and what they did is made pilot holes so that they could drive the nails in the wrists, which the shroud shows. Now, because art portrays Jesus' nails being driven through the hand, he explained this, that the hand, because there's no bone that would be in the palm of the hand, the body and all the weight would tear down. So what they did is they drove it into his, I don't remember the radial nerve he called it, but it's in the wrist. And they drove those nails through the wrist to hold them. And he explained it to us that, medically speaking, this would be if you whacked your phony bone, when you've had that sensation. And he said, unfortunately, for Jesus, or those crucified with that, when it went through the wrist, that pain never subsided. It would always be like that during the entire time before they died. But what I was going back to, they would often use rope. If the pilot hole couldn't be reached because of the man's natural proportions, they would take the rope around and pull the arm out of the socket until it would match the pilot hole for the wrist. And they believe from the shroud this is what happened to Jesus, because if you look at the picture with Jesus' hands folded in the shroud, the right arm is longer than the left. And of course the shroud has the side wound in the right side. So this passion that Jesus underwent, and from what this expert explained, that there were a couple interesting points I'll point out to you, fellow listeners, is that one of the things we know in the agony of garden, and I don't remember the scientific term he gave it, is Jesus sweating blood, but when people are under such stress and anxiety, they literally, these blood vessels pop and allow them the blood to pour out with the sweat. And he said that Jesus is one of the worst agonies he experienced in his passion. And it had to be this way for us, Can you imagine that? For love of us, to undergo all this. And as St. Paul said, for sinners, we're not just, but for sinners, was the betrayal. The betrayal of those who were his closest that left. And then, can you imagine what he must have felt, as well as Mother Mary, seeing all this torture take place? You know, he demonstrated a couple of techniques that the Roman soldiers did to scourge the people. Oh, my gosh, listeners. Just incredible brutal. Incredible brutal. They would take the flagellum and take it with a backhand motion, and they would compete, I guess, in a way, to see who could outdo each other. And he said that they used to drink in like a sports event, psych themselves up to see who could do the most damage. And I believe, and don't quote me on this, I think he said that the shrouds showed at least 347 of the markings. Incredible, incredible torture. All over his body. All over his body. And it was really a very powerful presentation. My point of this is that Jesus underwent this horrific torture and passion to make things right and to defeat Satan, to take the victory away from Satan and give it to us, so that here is the key, folks. The gates of heaven would be open once again, which were shut in the Garden of Eden. Now I want to give you some food for thought from his presentation that I found this very interesting. And you know, me being on the spiritual side, I kind of like it. He said that he asked the question on why Jesus died at 3 o'clock. And he said that this was to make right what happened to Adam. Because what happened to Adam and Eve was in the daily breezes of the day, which he said that first century Jews certainly knew that in the heat of the day, that those daily breezes came in at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that made it right what went wrong. Jesus outdid everything Satan did. So I thought that was quite interesting. Because we must remember, as Satan tries to twist everything, as God has procreation, between the conjugal act between a married woman and man to produce that child, Satan twists it and has the abortion come in to destroy that child and to take that beautiful, holy, sacred act and distort it. So God is going to turn around and make everything that Satan tries to distort good, pure, and holy, and to make it right. So, again, back to my point, if Christ had to undergo this passion and suffering because of the hatredness and destruction of Satan, why do we think that it's so easy today just to obtain eternal life and to walk the way of Christ and to be a Christian in today's world and society? It just can't be that easy. You as well as I know out there listening. If you're an athlete, if you worked or went to school for years, worked your way up through the career ladder, sacrificed for your family to build something of it, worked hard to strive for anything in your life, you knew it took hard work. In most cases, it is not just dumped upon your lap. You take an athlete like a professional baseball player, hours and hours before the game, crafting his trade, fielding, batting practice, shagging fly balls, tapes, the videos that they watch to see opposing players, to see what's wrong with their swing or their pitching mechanics, hours before the game, game after game, and then they play the game. And all the years it took to get them to that level just doesn't happen overnight. Not even for those blessed with great talent by God. They still have to pay their dues. And we, as human beings, for the most part, know about paying our dues. So we need to put in our spiritual effort to help with Christ's mission to bring souls to Him at the end of our lives, because as you know, if you listen to the show, that is the main battle. That is the biggie. And we see, as I mentioned, the devil trying to offset and distort, and that's where this confusion comes in. The devil is now leading people to actually believe, and those I believe, again, personal opinion now, those I believe that are in power are certainly attracted to this idea that this is a possibility, which it cannot be and will not be. It will not be. But they don't believe that. And that's the part that should be worrisome for us. And maybe that's the wrong word, because we don't want to worry because we know God wins, He's in charge. But it's in our human makeup. We've got to fight the fight. It means we can't be naive and just, well, God's in charge, He'll take care of everything. We have to do our part. That's what the church militant is here on earth. We're not the church triumphant in heaven yet. We need to do our part and engage in the battle. And you and I both know it is a battle. So we need to stand up, because we see, as I mentioned, an agenda-driven media that is not interested at all in telling the truth. They're not. They have an agenda. They have their meetings. They are told what to do, what not to do, and to come through. Now, does this mean that all journalists are bad and bad reporters? No. There's very good journalists out there. But a lot of times, don't forget, they have a paycheck coming in, and they have bosses. And if the bosses are going to squelch a story or want to change the meaning of a few lines or words to take the story out of context, it's a very difficult decision to make for those folks if they don't want to lose a paycheck and a job, maybe even be blackballed in a career or play ball. But for you and I, it means we have to pray for that gift of discernment to know what is truth and what is not. And that means doing our homework. There are very good news agencies out there, but you have to get on the internet and you have to take the time. And this is the difficult part, especially if you're working. Because by the time you get home from work, especially if you've got family and kids, most of us aren't going to want to get into the heavy stuff of looking at news research at the end of a long day, especially if we've got a long day coming the next day at our job. So we turn on the main channels and let them tell us what's happening. And that's where you can see where it happens, but that is not the best avenue for us to choose. And maybe on our lunch breaks, if we have time or something, we can hit some of the better news agencies. And you've got to look for them, because they're out there. They actually just report the facts, which is something that's unusual today, especially in editorial comments. Because we've got to remember, when it's agenda-driven, they're trying to influence how people think, which means, like in a political realm, that means how to vote, how to buy certain products. And the most dangerous to me is what values, theirs, are imprinted upon you, and even worse, the kids. And we see that in the universities, where that may be the most dangerous of all the influencing factors that we have. Because the media in Hollywood are very strong indicators on what people should and shouldn't be doing. And we do fall into that trap. We want to be part of that in crowd. And as a Christian, we know that we have to be countercultural, and it's tough, especially when the majority of the culture and the majority of the way things are financially are structured for that in crowd and to go along with the flow. But remember, as G.K. Chesterton said, the fish that fight upstream are alive, and they're fighting. And those that are just going with the flow are usually the ones that are dead and going with the current. And those university professors now, when you think about it, and again, I'm generalizing, I'll be the first to say that, there are good professors. But I will be honest, and I believe that the conservative ones that have a good base, a good moral base, are probably few and far between in our universities today. when you and I witnessed what happened at Berkeley with mass students encouraged by the faculty, encouraged by the people in power, and maybe that's not the right word, but we know what the people in power did not want those campus police to interfere. Burning, looting, smashing, there's something wrong. Granted, you have to pay for college, but it's still a privilege. And whether you disagree with one opinion or not, this country still supposedly believes in free speech. But that, I think we can see, is rapidly changing. You have free speech as long as people that are in power allow you to have the free speech that they believe in. But a view that is dissenting, you may pay the penalty. But when you have a captive audience that needs a grade, it's the same thing as a journalist with the paycheck. You have power over those people. And what it's going to take is for us as Christians to do our research and find out truth. Now, as Christians, and I'm talking now to all Christians, I'm talking to even the Catholics out there who believe in abortion, who believe in the homosexual marriage. I'm asking you to take a look and do some research and really take a heartfelt spirit, pray on this, on whether those Catholic Church teachings that you are disagreeing with are the correct ones. The Church has over 2,000 years of experience, and granted it's had its troubles, it's had its scandals, because as Pope Francis said, it needs to be a hospital for the sick, which means sinners. So since we're sinners, we're going to have those problems. But we're also going to have the heroic popes, the holy people, the holy saints, and the holy ordinary people that do the day in and day out struggle to keep the Church strong and hoping one day, too, they become saints. But then in a 40 or 50 or 60-year period, that you have more wisdom than the Church, that can be very arrogant. And we need, I believe, to look at that. Because the Church has reasons for what they say. When Pope Paul VI issued his encyclical, Humanae Vitae, and about contraception, if you go and read what he says, you can get his transcript online. Everything he predicted, folks, has come true. Divorce rate skyrocketing. Abortion. On the other end of the spectrum, euthanasia. Breakdown in authority. The wild 60s are what we're living. For those of us old enough to remember, that is the society, what they wanted is what we're living. And I think most of us, I would hope, agree that it may not be working out too well for that type of utopia. You know, you hear a lot about, the priest shortage. And that's also, be careful on how you can be led astray. For this is an example I'd like to share with you. That there's a call for that now because of the priest shortage, that, boy, if you had married priests, it would end. That would be okay. You'd have a lot more priests. Well, let's look at this. We have a 52% divorce rate in the United States. And if you look at the Christian ministers in other faiths, you'll see that that's about right. You'll see that that is about right for lay people that are married that are Catholic. So we then have to go to the next step and say that this would happen also with priests that were married. And that opens up quite a bit of interesting discussion. What happens now to the alimony? Who pays for that? What if there's children and child support? What if there are properties involved? What if the priest's husband wants to have more children, but the spouse says they can't afford it, and we've got to practice contraceptive. What happens if those contraceptive methods fail and an unexpected child comes and the partner of the priest wants to abort it? How do you go up on that pulpit and talk about the church morals? There are many, many, many things that are left out in a truthful discussion, and you can see just by this priest discussion. Plus, one of the things that I have seen with the priests, when I have dealt with those priests that I've known through the years, is their incredible dedication and one unswerving self-sacrifice of their lives. If you have a parishioner that is in trouble at 2 o'clock in the morning or needs the extreme unction, they're there, whether they're sleeping or not. A great priest, Father Thomas Gaffney of St. Joseph's, was with my father when he needed that and was dying. And I'll never forget, he had a huge project going on he was so excited about for the church. He had looked forward to this for months, and he had to be there. And when they came to do the project, that was the day my father was going to die, and I called him. He came, and he spent so much time with us, gave him the extreme unction, spent time with us, and then went back to where he had to be. But he knew what was important. A soul was dying. And very well could have gotten that soul, my father, into heaven by his sacrifice. Sometimes when he would do his office, he would be so tired at night from such a long day, he would literally fall asleep and fall off the stool. Think about that. Now, when you're married, and for those of us that are, you have family obligations, and you cannot be at the service as those celibate, singular priests. You cannot. It is physically impossible unless you have the gift of bilocution, and I don't think most married priests would probably have it. And that would create a great deal of conflict in a family setting or a need of the family as opposed to the need of the parishioner. So when people think that the simple reason is just to have married priests to fulfill the shortage, it's not being told the truth. And maybe the agenda is because, again, when we have confusion and we have a disrespect for this truth that we know that Christ has given, you might see that this is done to undermine the church, to make it and break it and put it like a secular institution. And we would be in big trouble because we don't want a Catholic Church that is conformed by the secular period of the time. We want a Catholic Church that is countercultural, and that means Catholics that are. And you know, that means it's tough. Because if you think what the Catholic Church, and you're practicing what the Church teaches in those doctrines and dogmas, it means you're going to run into the trouble, and you're going to run into that trouble in your family with those that don't believe in that in practice. And most of us don't want that opposition. We've got to keep peace. But there's a way to do it. There's a way to do things with love and make your point. There's a point when you'll know when to cut off if you pray for the gift of wisdom and discernment, and a point where you'll know when to go forward. And the best example is to live your life. If you're a practicing Catholic and you're in line with the Pope and you're practicing that faith, people will see. I'm not saying they're going to agree. I'm not going to say that they're going to say anything positive to you, but they'll see it, and it may implant a seed. And you never know, because with the Spirit and God can do wonders and miracles. And believe that, brothers and sisters. So we've got to stay firm. But that means, as I said, you got to do the homework, and you got to walk the talk. And man, that is so difficult some days. Some days it looks like we're just spirit-filled, lifting up to those clouds, and we're going to grab the brass ring. In other days, it is complete chaos. But we've got to stay focused. We've got to stay focused. And we've got to remember, and I want to shift gears a little, but I want to encourage you to please go out, pray when you hear a story, think about all the aspects, the context, do some homework. You know, sometimes I think you might enjoy it even if you're tired. It's really interesting to see a credible news source and see things that are totally opposite than what you just get force-fed. And it gives you a perspective, because that's what we need. And we've got to ask ourselves, what is the purpose here? What is the agenda driven? You know, when the church has, their concern is the salvation of souls and aspects of social programs here to help the suffering and the poor. But the main thing of the church is our eternal salvation and the salvation of souls. And that's their agenda. They want the best for us. That is to be with God in heaven at the end of our lives. So we have to ask what the other purpose is. Because if it's to take life, or if it's to smother someone else's rights so that we can have a better lifestyle, we've got to be very aware of that. We've got to be very aware of that and do the due diligence that we need to see that, discern it, and do what we can. It may be as easy as writing your senator or your representative a letter, or contacting him, getting involved in voting in politicians that are more with the church's teachings. It may be not buying products with companies that sponsor shows that are against our Catholic faith, or watching those shows and calling in. You know, as much as I like baseball, I will not watch the World Series on that network Fox, or the All-Star game, which I missed last night, because they show us so-called Lucifer. Now, anything that's going to glorify the devil, even if the show's name is just that, I'm not going to watch that network, and I don't. And sometimes it's not easy. I wanted to watch the Cubs. They hadn't been in a World Series in years against Cleveland last year, but I wouldn't do it. And I'm not trying to brag myself here. Please don't take that. It's just sometimes that's what it's going to take. And that kind of discipline will get you into even more things. And then we make a difference, folks. We make a difference. Now, one of the things I want to shift gears here is I want to talk about something that's very difficult for Catholics. And it requires a great dose of the Holy Spirit, especially in these times. But as I mentioned the Passion of Christ, and I want to tie that in to what we talked about earlier about his passion, is God forgave us. And he paid an awful price because he loves us and he wanted to forgive us. Which means, like in our prayer, the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, talk about something easier said than done. And I'm not going to kid you and say that's easy for me. I often think if something happened to my nephews, nieces, wife, family members, friends, would I be able to forgive? I thank God I have not been in that situation, but there are others that have, and some have done this. Some have done this. Some in Rwanda have forgiven those that killed and murdered their entire families and butchered them. And that is incredible. That is a gift of the Spirit that we need to pray. And that is an extreme forgiveness, like Christ. But I want to talk about maybe a little bit, but just as harmful for us, just as harmful, the forgiveness like grudges we have in our family. I don't know how many family members out there have, well, I haven't talked to them in 20 years. You know, 20 years ago at that party, they said something, and they offended me, and I have nothing to do with them. Wow. Think about that. Really think and pray about that. You're turning your back on that person. And if you don't get a chance at your deathbed to make it right, wow. You know, that's the thing we need to do too, including myself at Mass. You know, Christ talks about if you've got a problem with your brother, to take care of it before you go up and receive him in the Eucharist. But we need to pray to the Spirit to ask for forgiveness. And in this world we live in now, there's a lot of rage and anger. We watch the news or read it. We see the stories. We hear about things in our own life experience. And it doesn't seem to a lot of justice out there. There seems to be a double standard between those in power and those who are not in a justice system that's run amok. That some people speak for life and others don't. Others take it. That there's a class and the rules for the wealthy that can afford great lawyers, and then there is the system for the poor who should be swept away and put away and forgotten. And when these crimes are committed against us and these affronts are committed against us, it's easy to feel rage. Right now, we're hoping and praying, I hope most of us, for I believe the baby's name is Charlie Gard, who both Pope Francis and President Trump want to do something for. So say in your prayers tonight, because they're going to have a court decision, apparently, that if the parents can come up with good new evidence, they'll allow him to at least take Charlie Gard home, and he can, if he can't have a miraculous healing, at least he can die. So you see people being outraged by this at a court system that tells the parents, you don't have rights over your child, even though he's yours. We'll take over. The so-called state. So it's easy to get upset. But we need to pray when we have these grudges or these affronts, to pray for forgiveness. Now, one of the things we can do is we can go to that person and not get into, well, I was justified in this because you did this and you said that and your brother said this about my wife, and that's just going to escalate. What we need to do in that humbleness, and it's tough, is to go and just say, I know I upset you, and I said some things I shouldn't have. And we've all done that in our lives. We've all done it. And just ask for their forgiveness. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be warm fuzzies with this person. If you've got a co-worker that has made your life a living nightmare, you can forgive them, but it doesn't mean you have to go to ball games with them or picnics or anything else. You don't have to be a social butterfly with them and try to, follow them around and make everything right. It means you forgave them. And if they don't accept your forgiveness, well, you know what? That's on them. But you made the effort to make amends. You can shake their hands, let it go. You don't have to be their best bud, but you forgave them. And then you can pray for them. You pray for their well-being and their good, not their destruction. We don't want our prayer at night to be, God, bring down your wrath upon them, because we are no better. We're all sinners. We all have our strengths. We all have our weaknesses. But we got to be careful about asking the wrath of God to come down upon another human being. So you pray for their welfare and their goodness, and that's going to help you too. You don't have to have the warm fuzzies and the love that you may have had for your husband or wife in the beginning for those people. That's not what forgiveness is about. But it's about wishing goodness for them and not harm, and by far not causing harm. Not to become a sort of agent provocateur and work behind the scenes to cause them damage or scandal, because that's a very dangerous thing for our souls. And forgiveness is hard. But when we seek it, we've got to be able to give it. And when you're a Catholic Christian like us and we go to ask God for forgiveness in the confessional, which is where we need to go, to ask our God to forgive us, and we get that sanctifying grace that allows us to forgive others, this will become easier and will grow in us and help us to become holier. Not an easy task. It may take years, it may take a lifetime, but we've got to strive for it. And then, as well as forgiving others, and this is a hard one. This is a hard one for me personally. We've got to forgive ourselves. We can't keep beating ourselves up for the sins we've committed and the lack of forgiveness that we have not showed to our fellow men and women. We are sinners, but the key for us is to get to confession, get cleaned up again, and go back out there. And when we fall again, we take up that cross, dust ourselves off, and head to confession again. And if you can't make confession, you ask God for His forgiveness. Because if you do intend to make confession, He knows your intention. And if something should happen, that is a very good thing for your soul, that you know that you are going to go next week to make confession. And if something tragic should happen to you, that you ask God for his forgiveness and he knew you were going to go and make it right. But we need to let go of the unforgiveness that we heap upon ourselves, no matter what it is. And that's tough. That's why groups like Rachel Vineyard that help the women that have had abortions to be over after years and years and years of this guilt-ridden tragedies, to be able to forgive themselves, which is the first step in their healing. Because that's what forgiveness is going to bring us. We'll be healed. We'll be healed interior with our souls. And we'll be able to take that healing out and heal those broken relationships we have. And as I mentioned, if those individuals do not want that type of healing, that is upon them. You've made the effort, and God knows. And maybe God will work through another way. But you've made the effort, and it's important. But those healings will come. There'll be healings for people. And there's nothing more than people who have been estranged for years and years to embrace each other in a hug, tears flowing, and admit that they forgive each other and start new. Because, that's what life in the gospel and life in Christ is about. It's about starting new. Never being beaten down and never losing hope. And the battle in the game never over. As long as we're breathing, we can accomplish this and have this forgiveness and continue on our path to holiness. And we need to believe that so we don't get down in the dumps where we despair, a trick of the devil, where we feel there is no hope, that all hope is lost, and that we are doomed. We never, never, never want to go there. And pray for that. Pray for that. To always hold hope, no matter how dark or how little that light seems to be in your life right now, but to hold on. And it's okay to ask people for forgiveness, especially for men. That's a sign of strength. That's a sign of strength. That's not a sign of weakness. Saying I'd never say sorry, wow, that is supreme arrogance, and that is definitely not coming from God. But that humility is strength. It's just the same thing as courage in life. It doesn't mean we're not afraid. The fear may be almost paralyzing. But the courage part comes in when we get out of that paralytic state and continue to do what we need to do and march forward despite fear. That's courage. Not being fearless, but being afraid and showing courage to continue. And that's what we need to do.
End, Al.
Okay, well, that will wrap it up for this week. So, God bless, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you in church.
Well, we'll be back again next week, same time, same station, with another wonderful program of Catholic Mysticism with Al Bielawski. Very good program again today, Al.
Thank you, Bob.
And in the meantime, may God bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen. See you next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.